From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
The Supreme Court is on the ballot next Tuesday after Kamala Harris endorses an overhaul of the nation's highest court while refusing to disavow court packing. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleagues, columnist Kim Strassel and editorial board member Monet Ukwe-Barua. In every presidential year, the Supreme Court's future is on the ballot to some degree, since the winner of that election gets to choose new justices to fill vacancies as they arise. But this year, the stakes seem higher, particularly if Kamala Harris wins the White House and Democrats keep control of the Senate. Harris has declined to put much distance between herself and President Biden on many issues, which is a political mistake in my view, but add to that list the idea of Supreme Court reform. After Joe Biden this summer endorsed the idea of term limits and some kind of enforceable ethics code for the justices, his VP said she supported his plan. And at a CNN town hall last week, asked if she would back the idea of adding justices to the Supreme Court, perhaps 3 of them, to create a 12-justice body. Here is what Kamala Harris said.
There is no question that the American people increasingly are losing confidence in the Supreme Court. And in large part because of the behavior of certain members of that court and because of certain rulings, including the Dobbs decision and taking away a precedent that had been in place for 50 years, protecting a woman's right to make decisions about her own body. So I do believe that there should be some kind of reform of the court, and we can study what that actually looks like.
Kim, what do you make of that answer or non-answer, as the case may be? And how serious do you think voters should take this idea coming from Democratic politicians, including Kamala Harris?
Well, in terms of the answer, I think that answer is a perfect illustration of Kamala Harris's problem with the electorate, in that we know that she has tried to distance herself publicly from some of her own more radical positions of the past, saying, for instance, that she no longer believes in banning fracking. She no longer wants to get rid of your private health care insurance. But when you hear an answer like this, it explains why people don't really trust her on that. She spent the last couple of weeks suggesting that she's the grown-up in this race, that she's the person that will be bipartisan, bring the country together. This is a radical proposal, something that even 4 or 5 years ago, everyone in the country agreed was definitely nothing more than a political power grab, a very extreme position on the left, but it has been mainstreamed in the Democratic Party, and now everyone agrees with it on the left. And we should be very clear about what it means. They are talking about, at the very least, imposing an ethics reform on the court that will invite political harassment of the justices and undermine judicial independence. At the most, they are talking about a wholesale restructure of the Supreme Court, which would either involve term limits, which are likely unconstitutional, or a dramatic packing of the court by expanding its size and putting new restrictions on what it can rule on, which is amazing. And we should be clear, too, why this is happening. This is not because Democrats are at all worried really about the sanctity of the court or its ethics. To the extent that there is falling confidence, it's mostly among Democrats who are listening to other Democrats on this campaign of vilifying the conservative justices on the court. They are doing this because it is a naked power grab. They are frustrated that they no longer have control of the court, that decisions are not going their way, and they are intent on doing whatever they have to wrench back that power into their own hands.
There are 2 Democratic bills in Congress that are worth talking about. The first one is from Oregon Senator Ron Wyden. It was introduced last month. It's called the Judicial Modernization and Transparency Act. And one thing that it would do is expand the Supreme Court to 15 justices over 3 presidential terms. So the next 3 presidents would get additional court picks until the total number of justices hit 15. Now let's listen to Ron Wyden on KGN News arguing in support of this idea.
So it strikes me as an approach that reflects balance and accountability. And while bold, it doesn't strike me that having 6 additional judges over a 12-year period is anything other than common sense.
Monet, what's your response to that? And I would note that the number of justices on the Supreme Court is not in the Constitution. That is fixed in statute, and it has been at 9 since 1869. And so my view, I guess, is I have a hard time understanding what is common sense about changing it to 15 now, unless this is part of a response to decisions that Democrats and progressives don't agree with.
Well, that's absolutely right. I think that Americans understand the current composition of the Supreme Court to be a long-standing part of our tradition, part of the stability of the judicial system we've had in this country, and do still see the court as a largely reliable referee of the laws that has helped to constrain Congress in important ways. And so I think it's very transparent that the purpose of this bill is to fire up the progressive base of the Democratic Party, which of course can't stomach the fact that the Supreme Court now has a 6-3 conservative majority and believes that there's not going to be any chance within the next few presidential terms to potentially win it back merely by filling vacancies as they come up on the current 9-seat court, and think that if they have any chance of regaining control, it's going to have to be through packing the court. And I think that it's a political error on the part of the Democrats who are taking this tack, including Kamala Harris, when she says she's open to these kinds of reforms. Frankly, I think that a lot of Americans do like balance and do think that they would like to see the court come back in a potentially more moderate direction. I think that that's the reason why we've seen control of Congress flip so regularly at every midterm election. And I could easily see it being a winning issue for Kamala Harris to go out and say, the court now has a 6-3 Republican majority. That's led to controversial decisions like Dobbs, where we're seeing precedents be overturned. Obviously, abortion has been a big political winner for Democrats. If she then said, you should elect me so that when vacancies come up, I'm going to make sure that we can get more balance on the court and fairer opinions being heard. I think that there are a lot of suburban voters who would respond to that. But Democrats are overplaying now by saying what we need to do to remedy this is essentially to expand the court. And people don't want to see the rules being broken. They want to see Democrats say, let's try to shift the court back in a more progressive direction by winning elections and by making appointments and by playing within the rules. And I don't think that they're going to be very successful in saying that the court should be expanded. And I think that's going to create a lot of opening for moderates who say, we want the court to continue in the current composition according to the rules rather than any kind of transformational reform.
Hang tight. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Kim, to the point that you're making about the approval of the Supreme Court being split by party, by ideology, the numbers bear that out. Here are the Gallup figures in July 2024. Do you approve the job the Supreme Court is doing? 66% of Republicans said yes, 44% of independents, and 15% of Democrats. And those numbers bounce around a bit if you're looking at the longer trend over decades, but there's a clear break here in the last few years where those three lines are splitting apart. And some of that might have to do with the Dobbs ruling overturning Roe v. Wade, decisions that Democrats disapproved of and Republicans approved of. But I agree with your point that I think much of it also relates to this campaign about quote unquote ethics scandals against the court, even though we're still waiting for an example of a case where there was a clear conflict of interest, where the decision might have gone the other way, had some justice recused as he should have. And to my eye, there is nothing even close to that in the record of these accusations that are being made. I don't know if you agree, but my personal view is that packing the Supreme Court, this widen proposal to add 6 justices, is so far out there that even in a Kamala Harris administration with a Democratic Senate, I like to think that public approval would be so strongly against that move that it would fall flat. But there is plenty else here in these bills. The Wyden bill, for example, would require the IRS to publish tax returns of the justices. It says that 2/3 of the justices would be required to declare an act of Congress unconstitutional, which to my mind is an odd sort of thing. Are you going to put an American in prison under a law that a mere 55% of the Supreme Court has ruled is unconstitutional? I'm not sure how that would exactly shake out. There's a similar provision saying that 2/3 of the justices could vote to kick one of their fellow justices off a case, to enforce recusal. A similar bill by Sheldon Whitehouse. This one has passed the Senate Judiciary Committee, has a similar recusal provision, would invite complaints against the justices, which a lower panel of lower court judges would then investigate with subpoena power and the ability to take testimony. And Kim, that stuff, I think, would also be damaging because it would draw the court further into partisan warfare. I can only imagine these provisions being dragged into that, and you would have arguments preceding big cases over which justices have some sort of conflict and should their colleagues vote them off the case. And I guess my point is, even if the court packing is going nowhere, Kim, it seems like a lot of that other stuff Democrats are very serious about. And if you have 50 or 51 of them controlling the Senate, I don't have much confidence that there would be a Joe Manchin or someone of the moderate vein who would stand up and say, I'm not going to vote for that.
Well, first of all, on some of these other provisions, I think it's worthwhile stepping back and looking at this more broadly. Remember, our Constitution, and one of the great strengths of our Constitution and why this American experiment has been such a remarkable success, is that the founders wrote into the Constitution checks and balances so that no one branch of the government had total control or the ability to squelch the other branches entirely. And I think it's important to look at this Wyden bill in that context. It's one thing for Congress to have a discussion about the size of the Supreme Court. And, I guess I would have a little bit more faith in this Wyden bill if the stated purpose of it was to suggest, for instance, that the current number of justices can't handle the workload, for instance. I mean, we've had discussions about this in terms of lower courts, whether or not we don't need to create a new circuit because of the amount of cases that are coming through the population of the country. There's no argument for that in here. But it's one thing to have a discussion about the size of the court. These other provisions, for instance, the 2/3 rule to invalidate an act of Congress, that is absurd. It is, again, this sort of aggressive attempt by the legislative branch to dictate to the judiciary what it may or may not rule on and what the level needs to be for it to invalidate an act of Congress. The arrogance of it is really quite stunning. But similarly, being able to dictate the ways in which that branch has to handle its questions of ethics in terms of recusals and the process by which that happens, again, incredibly prescriptive from a rival branch of government. The Supreme Court is not there dictating to Congress what it has to disclose to the public, for instance, in terms of its tax records, etc. It's reading the laws that are passed by Congress. So this is, in my mind, unseemly sort of wandering into the judiciary to tell it what to do. These provisions, too, that you put forward, that you outlined both in the White House bill and in the Wyden bill, that would allow the public, in essence, to file complaints or recusal motions against the justices, that is an absolute recipe for partisan warfare. We've already seen how this is playing out in the congressional and executive branches with lawfare, with increasing use of sicking law enforcement on your political rivals. This is an invitation for anyone who doesn't like a justice to step in, try to make a claim that they have to step down, give the other justices some sort of mechanism for removing them. To the extent we're talking about lack of confidence in the court, some of that, a lot of it is what you mentioned about rulings, and also about this very aggressive, relentless assault on it by the left. But part of it is also that the Supreme Court keeps getting thrust into these other political arguments. For instance, having to step in and settle these election disputes and lawfare disputes, which puts it in a difficult political position. These sort of things would just magnify that. And if anything, and I think it just goes to the point here, if Democrats truly cared about faith in the Supreme Court and its reputation, it would never be passing or suggesting legislation that created this sort of environment around the court.
And to that point, it also seems short-sighted to me because we have a 6-3 conservative court right now, but it is not out of the realm of imagining that it could be a 5-4 court again very soon, or even flip the other direction. The oldest justices on the sitting court are Justice Clarence Thomas, who is 76 and a half, and then Justice Samuel Alito, who is 74 and a half. That is followed then by liberal Justice Sonia Sotomayor at 70 and a half, and then Chief Justice John Roberts at 69 years and 9 months. We always, it's worth saying, wish our public officials of all political stripes good health and longevity. But Monet, it is not out of imagining that if Kamala Harris wins this election, maybe gets a second term, that she could get 1 or 2 or maybe even 3 appointments to the Supreme Court. And you could have a Supreme Court that tilts at least somewhat back in a liberal direction. And at that point, I think maybe Democrats will regret if they have done so much to undermine the Supreme Court that the public no longer has faith in it as a referee in these political disputes.
There's pressure already on Sonia Sotomayor to leave her seat in the event of a Kamala Harris victory. Of course, there's the recent memory of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who, of course, was much older and was in debilitating health, but she defied a lot of progressive pressure to leave her seat and then ended up dying during Donald Trump's presidency, and he had the opportunity to replace her with Amy Coney Barrett. That was a progressive nightmare, and they want to do everything they possibly can to avoid that. So I think it would be very likely that Sonia Sotomayor would heed to that pressure if Kamala Harris wins, which means they would get at least one chance to appoint someone who will potentially be able to serve long into the future. Of course, that wouldn't be a flipped seat. That would be simply maintaining a current progressive one. And I think it's very unlikely that Clarence Thomas or Samuel Alito would obviously resign during a Kamala Harris term. They both seem to be in good health and energetic and very active in their current roles on the court. And so there doesn't seem to be much likelihood that they would either pass away or leave. And I think that Democrats are very impatient. Obviously, there's Dobbs, which is huge, a failure from their perspective, a marquee piece of American law that was overturned by the current court. And they see it as a duty to their base to say that we want to do everything that we possibly can to regain control over the court in the near term. And there are a variety of other important issues that could fall before the court within the next couple of years. And I don't think that they think they can go to their base and say, we just want to play by the rules and bide our time and wait for control of the court to flip. They need to show their base that they're doing something aggressive to regain control. And so that's where you get a lot of that legislation coming from, suggesting that we're not going to wait, we're going to go on offense against this court. And that's why they've also tried to suggest that the court has not only ruled in a conservative direction within the confines of the law, but that the conservative justices have engaged in specious ethics violations. They're trying to lay the groundwork to say that we're justified. In fact, we're doing what we need to by reforming the court in all these ways.